Director of the Office of Religious Diversity and Pastoral Care, and the Muslim chaplain here at DePaul. So it's been a great honor to be part of this conference and to attend, and I'm honored to be asked to moderate this last roundtable session of the conference. Everything so far has been tremendously intellectually as well as spiritually challenging for me, and I'm sure this last panel will be just as stimulating. We will start with the panel today. The final panel's name is Naming Today's Idols, as you see here. And the first presenter will be Stephanie Wong. She has served since 2022 as an assistant professor of theology and religious studies at Villanova University. She's a scholar committed to deepening our understanding of global Catholicism, especially the cultural, political, and interreligious dynamics that shape the spiritual lives of Catholics in China and the diaspora. In her teaching, she offers undergrad courses on the Catholic, Buddhist, Taoist, and Confucian traditions, as well as graduate classes on methods of comparative reflection and dialogue between these communities. She received her PhD in theological and religious studies at Georgetown and her MDiv at Yale. And as you see, her presentation today will be on the topic, "And You'll Be Protected, Job 11:18, a Chinese critique of security." Let us all welcome Stephanie. Thank you.
In the book of Job, when Job has lost everything, had all his property destroyed, suffered the death of his children, racked with physical and illness and sores, 3 of his friends come round to comfort him. But what they end up doing instead is blame him for his pain and insecurity. Now, we listeners of the story know from the narrative prologue that Job's suffering is a result of a wager between God and the devil rather than anything he caused. And throughout the book, Job himself keeps maintaining that he's not a terrible sinner. And if he is a sinner, then the suffering seems utterly disproportional and extreme. But when his friends show up, they utterly fail to meet Job in his despair and are more interested in reasserting their inherited theology, namely the idea that God operates the universe according to justice, rewarding the righteous and punishing sinners. So over a painful 28 chapters, the friends fail to really register the homeless, grieving, bloody person in front of them, instead spinning explanations about where he went wrong and how they are comparatively on track. First, Eliphaz suggests that Job is arrogant and recalcitrant to God's discipline, insinuating that Job is in denial of his sinfulness. Quote, "Remember, who that was innocent ever perished? Or where were the upright cut off?" Then Bildad urges Job to repent and be restored to God. Whatever sins Job must have committed, it has clearly resulted in calamities. And here Bildad helpfully reminds Job of just all the horrors he has faced and how far he has fallen. And he tells his friend that the sooner he heeds the wisdom of the tradition, the better. Quote, "If you seek God and plead with the Almighty for mercy, if you are pure and upright, surely then he will rouse himself for you and restore your rightful habitation." Finally, the third friend, Zophar, piles on too, castigating Job for daring to question the justice of God. For Zophar, Job's inability to accept his suffering demonstrates that he is indeed one of the wicked. So Zophar too doubles down on the notion that Job must have done something to deserve the horrors he's faced. And he advises Job to fix himself and repent so that he might be restored from shame and vulnerability to a non-anxious safety. "If you devote yourself to God," he says, and this is the quote that inspired my presentation, "then surely you will lift your face up without blemish, and you will be secure and will not fear. Then you will feel secure because here is hope. You will look around and take your rest in security." Now, there's an awful lot to say about the book of Job and its humbling thesis overall. that neither Job nor any of his friends are actually in a position to judge whether God runs the universe according to justice or not. When God eventually shows up and speaks in the last part of the book, the chastening lesson for all is that humans' temporally and spatially finite perspectives are simply not cosmic enough to assess what the ultimate effect of this or that dynamic in the universe might be. But I want to note and dwell on the friends' accusations here, because through them, the book of Job names an idol that reigned then, and I think reigns today all the more: security. Why do the friends do this to Job? Well, like all good idols, it approximates something attractive, something good, and appeals so understandably. After all, who wouldn't want security or safety, at least in the sense of basic stability for carrying out your life, safety to raise your kids, reassurance that whatever you do today isn't going to be blown up tomorrow? And much of the friend's advice to Job even sounds roughly spiritually right. Don't jump to quickly accuse gods for your misfortunes. Maybe you're missing something. So how does the hope of security then become idolatrous? And where do the friends go wrong to such an extent that they are really quite cruel to him? Well, first, I want to point out two ways in which I think there's something idolatrous going on. That might help us identify kind of features of idolatry. And the first one is that there's something inaccurate, something kind of unreal in preoccupations with one's own safety, which I think often become oddly more heightened as a discourse the safer one is. Just a personal example, really anecdotal. So my grandmother, who grew up in Shanghai, she suffered terribly the losses of war, violence, invasion, immigration, multiple dislocations in every which direction across the globe. And so this is a picture of the bombing of Shanghai and the subsequent occupation by the Japanese. She lived through the Civil War and so suffered so much in terms of loss of assets, language, imagined career and family trajectories, citizenship. But the striking thing about her is that she actually very rarely talked about something like security or safety. I think she cared about it in substance, but she worried about the family in much more concrete and practical terms. Actually, what was called natural wealth earlier, I liked that term. She talked about water access, housing, doing your work in school, eating your vegetables. But perhaps because she'd lost everything once, twice, 3 times, she was actually quite a minimalist and never kept much in her house, and she treated any sort of gain that did arise in her life as something of a surprise. She held everything very lightly. In comparison, my father in the next generation lived a much more confident life of project building and asset acquisition, going not only to college but also to law school. He became interested in real estate, and he was comparatively far more fearful as a person. He very keen to adopt whatever financial and material products could buffer the self from loss. And so I remember, somewhat humorously though, but it's revealing, I think, his fascination with any kind of product of safety. Insurance policies of all kinds, home alarm systems, padlocks, combination locks, pepper spray, heavy-duty writing pens and flashlights, any gadget that if someone came up to you on the streets of Hong Kong or Los Angeles, maybe you could bludgeon them and defend yourself. Now, certainly there's something to be said about intergenerational trauma and the gendered or classed or racialized experiences that have often supercharged a sense of precarity for good reason. But I'm trying to point out a kind of spiritual irony that seems to play out in a lot of contexts, that the greater objective safety you have, the greater fearfulness that it invites. And if we pivot here to the US, I think of, for instance, how it's often the wealthy that feel that they need to live in gated communities, or the very socially buffered who welcome policing of their neighborhoods as a hedge against losing equity, right? So, in other words, just as we see in the book of Job, where it's Job's non-suffering friends who raise the discourse of safety, perhaps here too, in our complex world, often security is ironically the discourse of those who are safe, maybe more than those who are vulnerable. So I think this unreality, this kind of perceptive dishonesty, is one tip-off that we might be dealing with an idol. Second, the supercharged anxieties of idolatry lead us to treat other people badly. And so I think I'm with this morning's panel in seeing idolatry less in terms of distorted desires or disordered joys, and more in terms of fears and anxieties. Think, for instance, of the whole Sarah-Hagar fiasco, where Sarah's desire for a child was not itself wrong, and indeed God had even promised a child to Abraham and Sarah. Yet they're so anxious they take it into their own hands, with Sarah telling Abraham to go impregnate Hagar, then later insisting that they be cast out, tossing Hagar and Ishmael to the winds. So it seems that when something not God has gripped us more than God, that spiritual error leads to ethical wrongs too, that instrumentalize others. And I think if there's something particularly modern about our obsession with security today, it's because technology gives more powerful tools to enact that. So we have, for instance, the rise of the security state, where techno-militarization has enabled them to surveil and patrol in much deeper and heavy-handed ways than was possible in previous centuries. And I think it's showing up in issues of personal security too. I'm sure parents have always worried about their kids, but GPS trackers mean we have a whole generation of kids growing up bereft of the experience of existing or moving about the world without being tracked. And I think we see these anxieties and the harm they do even in relatively ivory tower experiences like higher ed, where students are so anxious about grades that I sometimes hear in the hallways of my university students like literally harassing some of our very vulnerable adjuncts and lecturers, demanding the grade that they're so upset for. And sometimes I want to know, what do these students will think is going to happen if they get a B, right? And they really believe their life might end. So I think if we notice how security has these idolatrous features, that it engenders false conceptions about reality and ourselves, and then actually invites us to treat people in damaging ways because of that sense of insecurity, we're onto something idolatrous. So I'm proposing that security is a kind of mega idol, undergirding a lot of the other idolatrous manifestations we've been talking about in this conference. And underneath so much of the cruelty in our world is this falsely reassuring notion that if you are secure, it's because you must have gotten something right, and if you or your community are insecure, then it's got to be somehow your fault for having neglected the right practices or attitudes. That's the basic critique of Job's friends. And throughout the book, Job is so frustrated because his friends are making it worse, right? They're taking their own anxious idolatry of safety okayness that they're clinging to, and it renders them incapable of attending to Job and his trauma. But instead, as our students like to say these days, the friends are gaslighting Job with all their suggestions that, well, things are really okay, because, well, their worlds are okay. The problem must be him, right? Now people know that intellectually that this isn't true. Cancer can strike anyone. Children in refugee camps had the terrible bad luck to be born there. But in this self-justifying illusion of security logic, responsible safety versus irresponsible vulnerability, the elite of the globalized world seem prepared to accept and rationalized an ever-heightened nationalism, militarism, wealth inequality, and all the rest. So, how do we theologize otherwise? As a comparative theologian who likes to think with Chinese traditions, I think there are resources that can help us recover a more communitarian and compassionate view of reality. Though we do have to be picky about what we think these traditions offer us what. And so I actually, even though I have great respect for Confucian thought and ethics and have worked a lot in other work, I actually don't think Confucianism is particularly helpful here for destabilizing human confidence in or the tendency to hold us responsible for what we've become and what sort of social experiences we have. I could say more about that, but for the sake of time, I'm going to go on. But there are other schools of Chinese thought that debated and critiqued the Confucians precisely on their sort of moral confidence about the logic of society, and which would perhaps also befuddle any Western capitalist individualist reading of the world that we've been worrying so much about here. So just one example, in the Taoist philosophical tradition, there's a great deal of skepticism about discursive claims and socialization, institutionalization in general. Because these create false mental divisions, the Taoists worried, and they alienate us from the transformation of things. This is why at the beginning of the Tao Te Ching, we have a warning against pretensions to be able to define precisely the Tao. The Tao Te Ching begins, is not the Tao that can be spoken of. So too in the Zhuangzi, at one point, Zhuangzi's friend Huishi comes across him after the death of his wife, and at first Huishi is kind of like shocked to find Zhuangzi beating on a drum and singing, because this doesn't seem appropriate and is not following ritual norms of grief. But he's beating on a drum and singing, having accepted that he could not secure his wife's presence in this world forever, and that her life, her body, came to be and now shift out of a continual transformation of things. In another passage, Zhuangzi tells a parable of a tree that a carpenter and his assistant find useless because it is twisted and gnarled. But the tree then speaks in a dream, pointing out that it's survived the harvestings and chopping downs of the humans precisely because it is useless. To be useless, says the tree, is very useful to me. And all this invites us to be skeptical of the claims and structures that society installs around us and whether they are really protecting us. Do we really want this world of heightened security in the name of protection? Arming elementary school teachers, we've heard that in the US, or biometric e-tracking of the population's movements, recently in Hong Kong. Who exactly is this useful for? I also think that the Moist tradition offers a lot of resources because of its account of cosmology, state consequentialism, and governance. Governance for the sake of the common good. And so maybe more than the Taoist kind of more anarchic vision and skeptical vision, the Moist tradition gives us something close to what Catholic social teaching has been concerned with, and maybe a useful dialogue partner for Pope Francis's call to destabilize the technocratic paradigm with fraternity. So Mozi is often characterized as a state consequentialist because he thought certain goods should be maximized: the population, order, and wealth of the state. Now that might sound like a recipe for nativism, autocracy, and greed to our Western contemporary ears here, where in the wake of European colonialism and American neocolonialism, we almost assume that it's in the nature of a secular state to expand and to enrich itself off the goods and labors extracted from other less valued people. But as you'll see, the Moist tradition, named after the 4th century BCE philosopher Modi, or Mozi, Master Mo, was actually not interested in empire or extraction. And so here's a list of some of the core chapters in the Mozi, which kind of capture a lot of Mozi's key ideas, packaging together some values that may seem surprising to us today. On the one hand, Mozi believed in meritocracy and hierarchy, thinking that society does need to recognize and reward competency. But this wasn't because some people are inherently better than others by birth or endowment, but just for the pragmatic reason that you want to get into leadership those people who've proved they can most effectively serve the common good of the people, and therefore are going to be more likely to hold the trust of the people. Yet on the other hand, this meritocracy was also not meant to be the ornate and often expensive hierarchy of the Confucians. And so Mozi writes against expensive rituals, which was a serious financial expense in ancient China, a lot of money spent on funerals. And even though this might seem weird to us, denounces music. I think he would have been very worried today to see how companies put so much money into massive productions like Super Bowl concerts, propping up the visibility and wealth of super rich athletes and stars, or to see how even rather poor people will pay thousands of dollars of tickets for an entertainer or a concert. So his critiques are, I think, destabilizing for some of our notions of what religious visionaries are about. And ironically, it's Moza's state consequentialism, especially maximizing the population of the state, which leads him to take a very strong position against war and imperial expansion, to be avoided at all costs. He's very critical of rulers who are forever sending people off to attack neighboring states out of vainglory, because A, this gets a lot of your own people killed, B, it prevents soldiers from being at home and families from having babies, and C, the people don't get the crops planted and harvested, which are so materially necessary for an ongoing thriving of the country. And what I find so interesting is that Moza grounds this ethic in a highly theological vision of heaven, which, even if there are debates about, say, whether like the Confucian Tian is kind of godlike or not, it's pretty clear that for Moza, this is a personality with a will and an intention. And the will of heaven, he says throughout his text, is towards Jian Ai, often translated as universal love, but perhaps better translated as impartial care, which is basically an affirmation of distributive justice, that just as heaven lets rain fall on all and not just the, quote, deserving, so too a community must distribute opportunities and care resources to all equitably, and not through favoritism, not through nepotism, preference for family or friends, to who looks upstanding or put together. No, Jian Ai, compassionate care for all. And so Confucians wanted to push back and defend a more particularist case for why some people are more deserving than others, right? Isn't it, well, the Confucians would say, isn't it natural to prefer and protect our family better than people we don't know? Isn't it the case that some people are just endowed with better substance and cultural refinement than others? And Moza rejects this on theological grounds, saying this is a distortion of the character of heaven. Of his philosophy, Moza says, I have heaven's intention, just like wheelwrights have compasses and carpenters have squares. What conforms is right and what conforms is wrong. And so for him, it is because of this commitment to the character of Tian and the intention of care of Tian for impartial care that ultimately has to guide this social vision for the common good and the accountability of it. I can talk more about Moza and some of his key quotes, but I just wanted to wrap up by coming back to Job. In the end of the story, we are not left wondering if the friends are actually right. Like, was it Job's friends? Were they correct to blame him? In fact, when God speaks, God makes it very clear that their blaming of him and their appeal to security and his fault in not having security is a kind of idol. So I'll close with a quote from the end of Job. After the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz, one of the friends, my wrath is kindled against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now therefore take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and offer for yourselves a burnt offering. And my servant Job shall pray for you, and I will accept his prayer not to deal with you according to your folly, for you have not spoken of me what is right. And with that, we see that after all the confusing narratives about safety, the hope of safety, and the blaming of Job for his lack of it, it is ultimately an idol, or at least a heresy that the friends had waged against him. And Job is vindicated in the end. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Wong, for that presentation. And as with the previous presentations, both for those in the room and for the people at home, we'll have a time for a Q&A, hopefully after them. So get your questions ready as we go into the last 2 presentations. The next presentation will be from Dr. David Ngong. Originally from Cameroon, Dr. Ngong currently serves as a professor of religion and theology at Stillman College in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. He has also taught at the University of Alabama, Tuscaloosa, and Baylor University, where he received his doctorate in religion with a focus on systematic theology. A member of the steering committee of the American Academy of Religion's African Religions Unit, Dr. Ngong works on the history and theology of African Christianity and African indigenous spirituality, concentrating specifically on contemporary African political theology. And he'll be speaking today on the topic, Did God Create Cameroon? Providence, Colonialism, and the Nation State in Africa. Let's welcome Dr. Ngong. Thank you.
I want to add my voice to thanking the Center for World Christianity for inviting us here today, this week, and to be part of this very important occasion. As it was indicated, I'll be presenting on Did God Create Cameroon? On the screen, you see this is a map of Cameroon. Now, this is the final map of Cameroon as it stands. As I'm going to show, it went through different iterations to come to what it is right now. Well, this is just in the form of outline of what we'll be covering. I did tell Karen a while ago that I have 19 pages to go through, and she said you can't do that. So I'm going to see how we go through this within the time frame provided. This image is an image of what is called a reunification monument of Cameroon that identifies, it symbolizes the reunification of what is called former French Cameroon and former English Cameroon, Anglophone Cameroon. So, what is my objective for today? This paper is an attempt at a theological reading of history, a history that has too often been taken for granted as somehow ordained by God. It is the history of the nation state in Africa. Taking the history of the creation of Cameroon as an example, the paper raises doubt about the narrative that sees the nation state in Africa as having divine approval. So if by the end of this you have second thoughts about whether God created Cameroon, then my job shall have been done. Now, when I was writing this paper, my 9th grade daughter came to my office and she took a look at the title of the paper I was writing, and she said, "Are you serious, Dad? Did God create Cameroon?" Of course, God created Cameroon. God created everything, and if God created everything, then God created Cameroon, And I want to begin by conceding to her, that I think she's right. If we think about the question in terms of a general idea of creation and of God as creator, then, of course, God created Cameroon. But the question that I am asking here is a little different from that. The question can be seen as dealing with the doctrine of creation, but the historical creation of a geographical, social, cultural, and political entity. The historical creation of lines on a map that are supposed to represent a people. To whom should the creation of this entity be credited? Should the coming into being of this historical entity, this map, be attributed to God, as is sometimes assumed? The question of whether God created Cameroon is thus whether, how, and if God was involved in the process of creating the nation state of Cameroon. Here, the question of creation becomes a question of providence, a question of how God works in history, and who should be seen as working the purposes of God in history. It is a question of which humans stand for God in the world, and how they do so, which I think is another way of thinking about idolatry. Thus, the question is not only about creation, but also about providence, about how God rules and cares for the world. Does God rule and care for the world through agents who claim God is using them to rule and care for the world? Or are these agents imposters? Even though I raised this question with reference to Cameroon, my claim is that it is a foundational theological question that should help us think about all nation states, especially African nation states. I provide an agnostic theological response to the question and argue that such agnostic theological response may help Christians better calibrate their relationship to the nation state. It may help them better calibrate their relationship to the nation state through seeing themselves as people who belong to Christ and the universal ecclesia rather than the nation state. Here I suggest the development of an alternative imagination that troubles the perception of the nation state as a divine agent. I work this out using Cameroon as case study, as I indicated. Cameroon, I will show, emerged through a messy colonial process that included imperialists, colonizers, anti-colonialists, and their post-colonial progenies. From the perspective of imperialists and colonizers, the creation of Cameroon was a burden divine providence placed on them, adumbrated through what might be described as imperialist or colonial theology. Now, imperialist theology had little doubt that God was working through the colonial processes to civilize Africans and other non-Western peoples by placing them under political units that were like those found in Europe. In this theology, the colonizers become divine, creating the colonized in their image. The goal was to shape Africans in the image of the colonizer's world so that they might become fit for the political unit that is the nation state. Anti-colonialists also seemed to have the emergence of the nation state as something that was providential. Some of them found explicit theological support for anti-colonial activity. Some of us today even tend to see this theological support as valid, as the stuff for a political or liberation theology. However, are the anti-colonial theological support for the creation of the nation state valid? Even in post-colonial times, the nation state is often depicted as the work of God, and its management conceived in soteriological terms. Here, those who play God are the ruling elite who control the workings of the nation state. The impression government officials often leave is that the government of these nation states have been instituted by God and so serve legitimate godly purposes that should be acknowledged and supported. In fact, the claim that these governments are godly is often adumbrated using biblical texts that appear to call on Christians to be subject to the state, or that depict the state as a godly part of a dynamic duo, the church on the one hand and the state on the other, God and Caesar. But is all this theologically valid? This paper seeks to cast doubt on these colonial, anti-colonial, and post-colonial theologies that undergird the creation and existence of the nation state in Africa. So why this project? Now, part of this project, one of the reasons, of course, which is not actually a reason, the first point that you see on the screen there draws from Bill's view of the migration of the holy, from the church to the state. In my view, it doesn't appear that something like that has happened in the African context. I don't think that something like that migration undergirds the African nation state. So it is not part of the reason why we should talk about this. I don't think that Africans generally have a kind of idolatrous, relationship to the nation state. What they have is what I call a paradox of perception. There are some who think very highly of the African nation state, and I think these people who think very highly of the African nation state, they are mostly the ruling elite. The preachers, for example, they do think very highly. The politicians, they do think very highly of the African nation state. But most ordinary people, at least from the Cameroonian context, most ordinary people don't really care, about the African nation state. For them, the nation state is as good as not. They experience the nation state mostly as a death-bringing, phenomenon to them. So they won't put their lives on the line unless they are made to do so, for the nation state. So I don't think that a project like this is required because of such an idolatry towards the nation state. But the second point, I think, is very significant. Many African nation states were created by Christians. So because of that, I think that we need to provide a sustained theological reflection of the nature and character of the nation state, because Christians created it. Christians created them. And I don't think that there has been sufficient thinking about what this thing is. What is this? What is this thing that we just assume that God brought to us somehow, and that we continue to see as something very, very divine. I think we need to question that. And in African political theology generally, the nation state is supreme, even though there are other things that we may talk about. But in African political theology, the nation state has come to be central. So I think because of that, we need to reflect really seriously on what the nation state is about. So, how did Cameroon come about? The history of Cameroon, like the history of many African countries, is a history that began without those who would eventually be called Cameroonians. The name itself does not name the people of the country, but rather the natural resources found there. The name, it is believed, began with the Portuguese who visited the coast of what became Cameroon and named it after a tributary where they caught prawns or shrimps. Rio dos Cameros, they called it. River of prawns or river of shrimps. In the hands of the Spaniards, the name became Camerones. You see how the movement is going. The name became Camerones for the Spaniards. Then came the Germans. It became Cameroon. K-A begins with a K. For the French, it became Cameroon, begins with a C. And for the British also, Cameroon, it begins also with a C, but ends with a double O. The French is O-U-N at the end. But the history of contemporary Cameroon was written by the British, the Germans, and the French beginning in the 19th century. What became Cameroon began as a patch of land on the coast of the country, which would change hands from the British to the Germans, and then back to the British and the French. Finally, it became the property of the Cameroonian ruling elite and their international collaborators. So, these maps that you see on the screen are the various iterations that Cameroon has taken over time. The first two maps show Cameroon under German colonial rule. It is made up of the coastal region Germany claimed from Britain and the interior, which Germany went on to acquire through questionable treaties and conquest. It should be noted that German interest in Cameroon began as the interest of German corporations. It is suggested that Otto von Bismarck, who was German chancellor when Cameroon became a German colony, was not even interested in acquiring overseas lands. It was, however, the exploit of German corporations that convinced him of the importance of securing German interests abroad. Germany officially colonized Cameroon when the German Gustav Nachtigal hoisted the German flag in the country on July 14th, 1884. Before 1884, it was a German protectorate. From 1884 to 1891, it was called German West Africa. From 1891 to 1901, it was called German Northwest Africa. And it was officially named Cameroon, K-A-M-E-R-U-N, in 1901. During this time, some corporations were set up in the homelands of indigenous peoples, carting these peoples off into reservations. It was under German colonial rule that the first official map of what eventually became Cameroon was created. German colonization of Cameroon would, however, not last for long, even though it left indelible marks on the country. Germany's ownership of Cameroon came to an end during what is described as the First World War, when Britain and France seized Cameroon from Germany. During the war, 1916, Cameroon was taken from Germany and divided between Britain and France. The third map showed a partitioned Cameroon between the British and the French taking the bulk of the country, which was called East Cameroon, and the British a tiny western slice called West Cameroon, divided between northern Cameroon and southern Cameroon. The fourth map shows the independent East Cameroon, which became La République du Cameroun in 1960. British Cameroons would not be granted independence as a country because it was said to be too small to sustain itself as an independent country. We are fighting a war about that to this day. Right. Its destiny rested on becoming independent by joining Nigeria or by joining La République du Cameroun. A plebiscite was conducted in 1961 to determine its destiny. In the plebiscite, northern Cameroons voted to become independent by joining Nigeria, and southern Cameroons voted to become independent by joining La République du Cameroun. The fifth map shows that northern Cameroons had joined Nigeria, and southern Cameroons joined La République du Cameroun. Map number 6 shows what is called a reunified Cameroon, which was called the Federal Republic of Cameroon after the 1961 plebiscite. Two significant changes took place after 1961. In 1972, a referendum was held through which the name of the country was changed from the Federal Republic of Cameroon to the United Republic of Cameroon. In 1984, the name of the country was changed again from the United Republic of Cameroon to La République du Cameroun, or the Republic of Cameroon. However, the geography of the country continues to be contested. We should note at this point that the reunification of Cameroon was described as providential by some anti-colonialists. When Cameroon was partitioned between Britain and France in 1916, many Cameroonians thought this would be a temporary situation, that the Germans would one day return and German Cameroon would be a reality again. In other words, people had become used to German Cameroon as a unit that they expected to see it continue in some fashion. Thus, when anti-colonial activities began in the region, some anti-colonialists nursed the hope that the two regions would be reunited. In fact, some anti-colonialists from East Cameroon often fled for cover in southern Cameroons. To them, the struggle for independence of East Cameroon was seen as providentially connected to the independence of southern Cameroon. The sentiment was expressed by one of Cameroon's most well-known anti-colonialists, Ruben Nyobe, when he said that the starting point of the independence struggle was to create a single Cameroon, that is, a Cameroon that unites the partitioned parts into German Cameroon before the partition. Nyobe is believed to have declared, Christianly speaking, Cameroon would become one country so that everyone would know that God created one Cameroon only. East Cameroon and Southern Cameroons eventually became united, but it was not the same as the partitioned Cameroon. The geography changed as part of the partitioned Cameroon went to Nigeria. So the map we saw at the beginning is what would be Cameroon. Now, the next point is how this history has been read providentially. I'm not going to detain us here. We don't have much time left. It's how theology has been used to justify the colonial, anti-colonial work and even post-colonial Cameroon. But what I want to end with I think I'm going to take perhaps a little more time, is how to read a map theologically. Once there was no Cameroon. Once there was no map of Cameroon. Imperial and colonial ambitions brought a map about. To read this map theologically, we first need to acknowledge that the map, like other maps, has become for many a source of orientation and belonging, but also delimitation and capture. It has become a source of orientation in the sense that it provides many with a place from which they may begin to think about who they are in the world. It is the place from which many stand and look at the world. What they think about the world is shaped by their experiences in that place. It is from there that they may move in any direction on the global map. When people say that they are Cameroonians, they are speaking the language of orientation. The map of Cameroon also bespeaks the place of belonging, because it is the place from which many find community, not only as a local phenomenon, but also as a global one. When people say they are Cameroonians, they are not only speaking the language of orientation, but also one of belonging. They are saying that here is where they find community, either in its local or extended form. Here is where they may call home. Here is where they find their roots. It is here that many move and live and have their beings. It is the place that shapes hopes and fears and creates dreams. However, as a place of delimitation and capture, it is the place where one is forced to be, a place one cannot live even if they wanted to, for good or ill. As a place of delimitation and capture, it sets limits to one's hopes. It is a place of delimitation and capture that the map becomes pernicious. So maps have their uses, even though they are also pernicious. Theologically, however, the map of Cameroon is a new creation that itself makes new creatures and endows them with new ways of being in the world. As a new creation, the map therefore has new creators and new divinities that endows its inhabitants with new humanity. It is in this sense that the map of Cameroon belongs to the doctrine of creation. As a new creation, its creators and sustainers are its new divinities. They are the ones who determine the conditions of possibility of its existence. They are the imperial and colonial elites. They are the anti-colonial elites. They are the post-colonial ruling elites. They determine who is to live and who is to die on this map. They determine who can live and who can stay, who belongs and who does not. Here, the new God is not the nation state. It's not the nation state itself, but its creators and sustainers. What the silent map often conceals, however, is the violent history through which the map was made. The map is therefore a mask that conceals the narratives of violence that mark and keeps it in being. While many may think the map is somehow natural, it is far from being natural. It is a brutal and brutalizing affair that thrives on forceful erasure of memory and conscription into an uncertain project that seeks to give one a new name and a new identity. It is an immanent and transitory identity based on the dictates of the map. For some, to say Cameroon is to name a trauma etched in the visible and invisible scars of their bodies, the bodies of their ancestors and the land itself. To say Cameroon is to evoke a memory of loss. So, how should Christians think about this map? Does each time a person names themselves as Cameroonian not name the duplicity, machination, and brutality that went into creating the map and which continues to sustain it? Does naming Cameroon not name an iniquitous process that names itself divine? How, then, should Christians think about this map, this instrument of violence created by imperial and colonial ambitions and sustained by post-colonial violence? Clearly, the nation state grants its own identity to people, including people who are Christians. To live in the world at this moment means, in all likelihood, to live in a nation state. In fact, being stateless is determined to be an anomaly. Perhaps the difference may lie in how Christian identity is shaped within the nation state. Here, it is important to note that the issue is not as simple as replacing a nation-state identity with an ecclesial one. In fact, in a sense, the Christian identity is not separate from nation-state identity. As was noted earlier, many of the nation-states in Africa were created by Christians. For some, missionary Christianity and colonialism were not separate things. Even today, many churches still closely identify themselves with the state. For example, we have Cameroon Baptist Convention, the Church of Uganda, among others. Thus, the church is also mired in the colonial and post-colonial machinations of the nation state, which is why to critique the nation state is at the same time to critique colonial Christianity in Africa. Given that that much of Christianity in Africa has been shaped and continues to be shaped by colonial and post-colonial politics, African Christian political critique of the nation state should go together with critique of the church. It must be acknowledged that the church does not necessarily shape a salutary imagination that problematizes the violence of the nation state. Often, the church has blessed it. What is needed is a rethinking of Christianity in ways that challenge its embeddedness in the colonial matrix of power, specifically in ways that challenge its identification of dynamics that sustain the nation state. Doing this requires a rethinking of what it means to be a Christian within the map into which one is born. As the Cameroonian theologian Professor Ebusi Bulaga taught us, to rethink the map, we need to start with our Christology, asking who Jesus Christ is and what it means to follow him. To understand who Jesus Christ is, Bulaga suggests, we need to place him within his historical context, which was a context in which religious and political leaders used their power to sustain the violence of the state and empire. In this context, Jesus presented a vision of the reign of God that transcended what Bulaga calls the ethnic and territorial principles. In other words, Jesus scrambled the map and relativizes it by teaching that people belong to God rather than to the ethnic group or the state. To believe in the reign of God is therefore to enter a different reality, a new reality not limited to a territory, not the territory of an ethnic group, not the territory of the nation state. To be baptized into Christ is to participate in a jailbreak of the iron cage of the map into which we are captured and circumscribed. To follow Jesus is therefore to develop an imagination that militates against state capture. State capture here understood as the delimitation of the space which determines our possibility. Here the lines of the map becomes just that, lines that are porous as space itself. Here we may remain in a place where we do not have to. We may also move if we choose to. Here, place is important, but is at the same time transcendent. Here, salvation is found not through the creation of a map, which is falsely believed to be sovereign and independent, but rather through the cultivation of interpersonal and intercommunal relationships informed by the dynamics of the reign of God. Here, the disciples of Christ remain in constant conflict with those who seek to limit the imagination to the creation of the nation state, rather than the creation of human and ecological well-being. Thus, the name of the map, the name of the nation state remains in constant tension with the name of Christ, because the vision of the reign of God transcends the vision of the nation state, which is captured in a map and prosecuted by the desires of the ruling elite who seek to play the role of God. So, finally, we need to doubt the ultimacy of the map, any map. Even though these maps may provide us with a sense of orientation and belonging, they may also be a source of capture and delimitation. To be baptized into Christ is to participate in a territorial jailbreak, to become part of unlimited time and space. Perhaps that is what eternal life means. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Our final presentation of the conference, and then we'll have the exciting Q&A session. We're going to welcome Dr. Jung Oh-sung. He was born in Seoul, South Korea, and has been living in Brazil for nearly 60 years. Holds a PhD degree in religious studies from the Methodist University of Sao Paulo and postdoctoral degree in education. Formerly, he served as a full professor in the religious studies postgraduate program at the Methodist University of Sao Paulo. He will be presenting today on the question, is idolatry dead? The discernment between the idol and the true God. Welcome.
First, hello. Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here. And second, 6 years ago, I got stroke. So I have to learn to speak again Portuguese, then a little bit of Spanish. I lost completely English, Korean. And so I'm in process of relearning English. So, and this is the second time that I get in a meeting with, in English. So, sorry. And now I'm so tired because after stroke I needed some rest between two sections, morning and afternoon. So here we are all day. So if I say something wrong or heretic, sorry, this is my stroke. So let's go. I think this theme of idolatry is one of the main, if not the main, challenges for Christian theology in today's world. Unlike religious studies, which studies religious phenomena, theology's central object of reflection is or should be God. But as St. Thomas, I'm very conservative in this way, Thomas Aquinas said, quote, we know more about what God is not than about what God is, unquote. In other words, people, churches, or institutions that debate or proclaiming God run the risk of speaking wrongly about God, just as the atheists can run the risk of criticizing the dominant image of God in society as non-existent, but in fact are denying the existence of a false and evil image of God. In the biblical tradition and in the history of Christianity, this is the theme of idolatry. Within the framework of modern society, the challenge for the church and modern theology was the relationship between faith and atheism, and at the same time, how to interpret and express the traditional teaching of the Christian faith in contemporary languages. In this sense, the topic of idolatry was secondary and was only discussed in the context of theology, the errors in the representation of God, or in the history of Christianity, when the concept of idolatry was used in the process of colonization to justify the exploitation of other peoples. I lost that. This was this one. So now, it's Pope Francis who has made the theme of idolatry with the expression, the idolatry of money, one of the central themes in the relationship between the church's mission and the contemporary society. Pope Benedict XVI, in this document Lumen Fidei, which was signed by Pope Francis after his resignation, also dealt with the themes of idolatry and opposed faith to idolatry. Quote, instead of faith in God, one prefers to worship the idol, whose face can be fixed and whose origin is known because it was made by us, unquote. And in a public audience in 2011, Pope Benedict XVI said, quote, whenever God disappears, man falls into slavery of idolatry, unquote. This is a fairly common approach in the modern theology, confronting the modern world with this anthropocentrism and criticizing that many theologians call nihilistic tendency to the extent that God ceases to be the ultimate meaning of life. However, Pope Francis' critique of idolatry of money is quite different. The critical concept of idolatry is being used not in the field of theology or religion, but economics, breaking down the separation consolidated by the process of secularization between the sphere of the public, the state and the market, and of the private life, where religion and faith should be situated. Furthermore, in the Catholic world, where the Church still has the tradition of proposing a doctrine or social teaching of the Church, the themes of money and market belong to the field of social morality and not theology as such, or dogmatic theology. In modern Catholic theology, dogmatic topics such as God, and therefore the errors of idolatry, are usually in the department of dogmatic or systematic theology, while the topics of economics and social issues belong to the field of social morality, a department that does not discuss the central question of God, but the practical application of what theology defines. In summary, Pope Francis much used expression, the idolatry of money, in his dialogue with the Catholic Church and with society, breaks these presuppositions of the understanding of what modern society is, and also of what the role of theology and what the mission of the Church is today. More than breaking with the dominant structure of understanding, the theme of idolatry of money is very relevant to society as such and also to Christianity. This is because behind the debate on this idolatry, we have the two great challenges of today's civilization: profound social inequality and the environmental crisis. Or to put in other way, for Pope Francis, the idolatry of money is the cause of the profound inequality and social exclusion and the environmental crisis that makes billions of people in the world suffer. As stated before, we know more about what God is not than what God is. That is, in order to know a little more about who or what God is, we first need to find out what the wrong image of God is. That is, what society and the people worship as God, but is actually just an idol. We will only discover that we may be worshiping an idol to the extent that we, through our human efforts, discover the internal contradictions of idolatrous practice and theology, and listen to what God reveals us in our lives and in history. Idolatry is not something that only occurs in religions of other peoples. Biblical traditions make it clear that Israel fought against the idolatry of worshiping the gods of other peoples, but it also made it clear that the people of Israel worshipped an idol given in the same name as Yahweh, the worship of the golden calf. And as Pope Francis says, the worship of the ancient gold calf has returned in a new and ruthless guise in the idolatry of money. We have seen that many times in this section. It's important to realize that the golden calf idol that has returned in the form of money idolatry is not the same as the one in the Bible, because the word and the way in which idols are made have changed. In the pre-modern world, the making of an idol is a relationship of a human subject who takes a material object and produces, by his action, a visible object that is seen, treated, and worshipped as a god, who comes to have power over his creator. In the modern world, a much more complex society, the relationship of idol creation is no longer direct or visible. The agent of the idol's creation is no longer a human being, but a social system or an intersubjective relationship, and its result, the idol, is no longer visible for biological eyes, but by its social faith. In the money idolatry of our time, people don't worship an object money, but abstract money, which can appear, for example, in the digits in a cell phone screen, flashing the number of billions of dollars as the expression of the sacrament of the desire for infinity. What drives a billionaire to fight to have hundreds of billions of dollars is not the desire to have objective things, for example, yachts, but the desire to be infinite and to try to achieve his utopia of infinite wealth. He will fight against the workers' right to fairer wages or pay less taxes that could help solve social problems, or not accept environmental crises that are necessary for sustainability of human life and the other living beings on the planet. However, if you talk to these billionaires or the CEOs of large companies, they will just justify themselves by saying that this is not an ethical problem, just they are not morally bad people, but it's the only way to efficiently organize the market. In other words, their argument is that the current capitalist market system has become impersonal and there is no alternative. When we say that there is no alternative and that this system is and should be above moral or human discussion, what we are saying is that this is sacred, something divine. To understand the newness and depth of the critique of idolatry of money, we need to complete the sentence we quote above, unquote. The worship of the ancient golden calf has returned in a new and ruthless guise in the idolatry of money and the dictatorship of an impersonal economy lacked a truly human purpose, unquote. The ultimate goal of the current market system and its major beneficiaries is the unlimited accumulation of wealth without considering its effects on the right to life of human beings and the environment. Thus, says the Pope, quote, whatever is fragile, like the environment, is defenseless before the interests of a deified market, which becomes the only rule, unquote. I need water. People accustomed to religious or theological language may feel strange when they hear this argument about deified market, or the similar expression, the idolatry of the market, and criticize that we are unduly mixing religions and economics. But if you pay attention to the speech of the great economists and businessmen, you will realize that the notion of faith, belief in the market, or the myth of the invisible hand of the market, which are the presuppositions of their speech, have religious or theological characteristics. In the specific field of theology, Michael Novak, a Catholic theologian who received the Templeton Prize for Progress in Religion in 1994, explicitly and theologically defended the capitalist market system for, quote, efficiency, productivity, inventiveness, and prosperity, unquote, and state that, quote, the image of God underlying both the free market and the triune system of democratic capitalism is phronimos, the practical, provident intelligence embodied in singular agent in singular concrete situation, unquote. And in his critique of liberation theology, which was at its peak in 1980s, in his book Toward a Theology of the Corporation, Novak says that, unquote, quote, the earth is charged with the grandeur of God, so is human history. If you look for signs of grace in the corporation, we may discern 7 of them suitable sacrament number, unquote. And that, quote, its creativity mirrors God's, unquote. Pope Francis and Michael Novak are 2 examples of thinkers in the fields of theology who radically opposed each other on the notion of God and idolatry. Novak points to the efficiency of the market system as a sign of God's presence in history, while Pope Francis criticized this same system for the lack of human purpose and social sensitivity to the suffering of the poor. For the sake of time, I'm going to present a biblical theological arguments for discerning what is of God and what is idolatrous, and not analyze any economic argument. The origin of the Pope's discourse on the idolatry of money and the market comes from Latin American liberation theology. Hugo Assmann, who together with Franz Hinckelhammer published the most important book on this subject, The Idolatry of Market, in 1989, says, quote, idols are the gods of oppression. Biblically, the concept of idol and idolatry is directly linked to the manipulation of religious symbols to create subjections, legitimize oppression, and support dominant powers in the organization of human coexistence. If you talk about idolatry and perverse theologies present in the history, in the economy, it's because we are concerned about the sacrifice of human lives, legitimized by idolatrous conception of economic process, unquote. The reason why this theology discusses the issues of idolatry and economics is to defend the lives of all people, especially those who are being sacrificed by unjust social religious system. The defense of life is the criterion that transcends the boundaries of areas of knowledge or the relationship between public and private spheres. And a central concept, both in theology and economics, in this critique is that of sacrifice. Sacrifice, present in all religions, is the religious act that makes something sacred, separate, to be offered to the gods. What interests us here is the fact that the sacrifice demanded by God, or the ultimate principle of the social system, inverts the ethical notion of good and evil. Killing a child is seen evil in any human society, except when this death is understood as the result of a demand from God or the ultimate principle of the society. Thus, for example, the death of poor children can be justified in the name of the loss of the market. Economists call this the social cost necessary for market adjustment. Many Christian theologians start from this assumption and try to fit Jesus' life, practice, and death into the sacrificial paradigm. However, Jesus breaks with fundamental structure of religions, that is sacrifice, and says, quote, go and learn what it means, I want mercy, not sacrifice. Unquote. The difference between the idol, a God who is the fruit of the works and interactions of social relations that justify and organize unjust and oppressive social system, between this idol and the God of life, is that the idol demands sacrifice of human lives, and the God revealed in Jesus asks for mercy and not sacrifice, so that all human beings can live with dignity. The question is not the name of God or the religious or cultural forms in which this God is worshipped, but whether it is a God who calls for sacrifice or mercy, the death of the weak and the poor, or dignified life for all people, regardless of whether they are included or excluded from the market. To avoid misunderstanding, I want to make it clear that what is being criticized here is the idolatry of market or money, and not the market and money as such, that which are necessary social instruments for social life. The good news of Jesus, that God does not ask us to sacrifice ourselves, and that there are no sins or failures that requires or justify sacrificing the lives of the victims of the unjust and oppressive relationship, is the discernment between the true God and the idol, or between a holy spirituality that is sensitive to those who suffer, and those spiritualities that are insensitive to human beings, who in the name of their God only seek the possession of wealth and power. Its path of following the Spirit of Jesus that reveals to us that many of us, or at time in our lives, have worshipped an idol. It's not theology or doctrine that reveals this to us, but the practice of following the way of the Holy Spirit in the Word. Psalm 115, verses 4 and 5, we find the same insight. But, I quote, "But their idols are silver and gold, made by human hands. They have mouth, but cannot speak, eyes, but cannot see. They have ears, but cannot hear, noses, but cannot smell. They have hands, but cannot feel, feet, but cannot walk, nor can they utter a sound with their throats. Those who make them will be like them, and so will all who trust in them." When we see an idol made of silver and gold, we know that it cannot see, it can hear, smell, and cannot walk or make sound. How then do idolaters of the past and today become like idol? It seems that Psalm's words don't make sense, because idolaters see, feel, and walk in the world. But we need to overcome the materialist view of idolatry relationship and see the spiritual reality of the psalm. God Yahweh, who revealed himself or itself or herself in the Exodus, is a God who sees the suffering of the people, hears their cry, and comes out of his word to walk with his people who are slaves, to set them free. The idolaters of our time, whatever the name of their religions, who only desire silver and gold, become like idols. They are incapable of seeing the suffering of the billions of the poor and oppressed people in the world, incapable of hearing their cries and becoming sensitive and compassionate towards them. The issue of idolatry is, in short, a matter of spiritual conversion, constantly repenting and accepting the good news of kingdom of God, following the path of Jesus, who came into the world not to demand sacrifice, but that all human beings might have life and life in abundance. In short, the way to discern God and idol is not in the level of theology. First is the orthopathos, has or not compassion. And who has orthopathos goes into the praxis. And after that praxis, we need a new theology, a new doctrine to speak, to express, and to explain for the society. Thank you.
Speakers, take a seat on the panel. So we have a good little over half an hour of time, so hopefully we can have a good discussion. I want to start by asking if anybody on the panel has any questions or quick remarks to share about the other presentation. Don't feel obligated. We can give more time for the other people, but I just want to give you the opportunity. If others have questions, you can come up as well. Yeah. Please.
May I start by thanking the three presenters. You have done a very great job. And I want to thank you that for every of the presentation, I had something unique to learn from any of you. And I'm very much impressed. And I would like to ask you a question that is very more practical. My name is Father Humphrey Ane. I teach in a major seminary in Nigeria that is affiliated to both a local university in Nigeria and Urban University Rome. And each of these universities represents a perspective. Actually, I teach epistemology. And sometimes when I receive the curriculum of studies from these two universities, I see conflict in the way epistemology is looked at today. And if I understand your presentations, why you succeeded in naming the contemporary idols. The first speaker talked about insecurity as the idol of today, false insecurity. The second person talked about false nationalism or false nation states. The last person actually named it money and market. So this same conflict comes in when I'm trying to organize, plan my timetable. And it leaves me with a wider problem that in the world today, where we have, thanks to internet, we have what looks like explosion of information, and then the consciousness of our plurality is heightened. And then these problems keep coming in. Whether it is in the soft skill courses, like the critical thinking, philosophy, and theology, or the STEM courses like science, technology, engineering, and all those things, this same conflict keep coming in. And I want to take my question to each of you. And the last speaker actually scratched a bit of where I want to go, where he said we need new method, we need new approach in doing theology. But I don't think theology is the only problem, the only area where we have problem with clash of perspectives and clash of interest. I have greater problem in epistemology. Because when you look at continental and conventional epistemology, which indigenous knowledge system today, there seems to be a war. So my question is, this new method you talk about, if each of you should be asked to draw in the light of hyper-consciousness of our pluralization as a society, a method of studies that should be able to help us rise above this and be able to help us destroy these modern-day ideals, because I strongly believe that what we know shape how we respond to the developments of our time. because there seems to be a binary division between this type of thinking and this type of thinking. So how do you find a ternary possibility or a methodology capable of incorporating these things in a ternary option that can help us avoid these new emerging idols? Thank you.
That's a really interesting question about method. I think what I was trying to do in my presentation was a move I think needs to be made is to question those things that seem so natural, so commonsensical that they can't be questioned. And so security in my mind is one of those things where, and this seems to me, you can disagree with me, but kind of a cross-cultural phenomenon right now that actually both in the Chinese context and in the US context, I see us excusing so much harm done to others on the grounds of security, right? Like how much harm is being done, say in the internment of the Uyghurs on grounds of national security concern, or how often do people not give to the poor because, oh, well, I haven't contributed to my retirement yet, right? So like there's this excusing of unethical behavior because the quest for safety, well, I might need that money. Well, we might need to protect ourselves and our children from this or that threat. Because that appeal to security seems so commonsensical, so natural, that people are kind of give it up at that point, right? If you say you're worried about your safety, then people stop questioning you and asking anything of you. So I think that's got to be part of the method, that it's precisely those areas where the excuse to not engage ethically seems commonsensical that we have to be most suspicious.
Thank you for the question. I think I will begin by saying that it is a good thing you are here and that you are gathering all of this, and that perhaps this may, in some way help you to develop a method, which we may not be able to provide right now. But speaking about what I presented in terms of how to conceptualize the nation state theologically, perhaps, I am not aware, of a widespread problematization, even from a secular or theological perspective of the nation state in terms of the claim that it makes to be a kind of divine phenomenon. I think the method, again, that I use in what I do is anti-colonial thinking, which influences, the way I approach these things. So perhaps that is something, if you are creating a course, you may want to consider, in helping students to engage in anti-colonial thought, because it is my understanding that even in African seminaries, much of what happens there is very Western in nature. African knowledge systems are hardly engaged significantly. So perhaps that is something that you may want to consider.
In my experience to working and talking with the people who teach in seminaries, the student that want to go to study theology has some kind of the spiritual experience. I saw Jesus, I accept Jesus in my heart, yeah. And when you get into the good school, usually professor talks about theology. When talk about the Bible is exegesis, Greek, Hebrew, and the people understand what's happened. What does the relationship? Why I'm here, and what are I'm demand to study. So I think the first thing is the question of the pedagogy. Why are teaching? Why God has revealed by Himself or herself, sorry, because of my English, to put people, not for to know something, is to be better. In order to be better, has to solve problems that are living, we're facing. So revelation in the Bible is not an encyclopedia. It's how to learn to solve the problems. And since that history changes, the solution doesn't change. It has to change. So because of the Bible, changes the concepts, doctrines. So we need to think in terms of Bible and to help the people in this process. What's our problem? All our people, all our community. What is the tradition can help us to understand? And what is the new knowledge of happening to understand what happened? So I didn't need a vaccine. Yeah, 30 years ago, the world changed this better way. No, but I have learned that this is the truth. No, the truth, the real truth of the Bible is the pedagogical process and to learn. Because of the Christian Bible has Holy Spirit. God, I am very fundamentalist in this discussion. Jesus says, what I'm saying, you don't understand. And when you go 50 years in from now, what I'm saying doesn't work. So Holy Spirit will to help. And then the community will put in the mouth of the Jesus a solution that Jesus didn't talk. And you realize that you understand. You articulate that within the tradition. So I think we have to. This is real epistemology. That was the beginning in Latin America. Liberation thought tried to do that, but it's easier to say you should do that. Other things that to write, teach books, or teach in this way. But it's easier to say this is the real path for liberation. No, there's no recipe for that.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank you all very much for an exemplary way to end our discussion here today. It's been really, could not have been better in terms of the way that so many things have been brought together well. I have a question for David. When you use the phrase to describe Christianity as a territorial jailbreak, you know that many of us are going to steal that phrase. You should take that as a compliment because it's no longer exclusively yours. I would like you to elaborate a little bit more, if you would, because I think in many ways your presentation in some ways was particularly robust in terms of eschatology, in terms of, sort of a bit of a pushback against some of the secularization of Christianity in the sense that how it keeps score has been reduced to levels of brute effectiveness as measured by conventional metrics. It seems to me that what you're outlining in sort of making a communal step back from obeisance to the nation state is itself a prefiguring of the kingdom of God, and that allows us to be freed from some of the more secularized notions of effectiveness, and in fact invites us into something much more transformative. If I'm reading you correctly, I'd love to hear more of what you're thinking.
Thank you very much, Buddy, for that compliment. I think you're exactly right in terms of thinking that what I'm getting at is a more expansive vision of what it may mean to be a Christian or a follower of Christ, and in terms of breaking out of a narrow territorial imagination by which we are often known and by which we often identify. And you are right that it is eschatological and informed by the vision of the reign of God, you know, which is, as far as I can think about it, is clearly, I think, non-territorial, especially not quite limited as we tend to do. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I have questions for you, Stephanie and David. So, in the narrative of Job, and I like the way you describe the question of insecurity, the fear, the trust. I just want to ask you, or rather complicate a little the narrative, that when the friends of Job came subsequently to report the tragedies, it always ended with, I alone escaped to tell you the story. You know, you see this constant rhythm, and then they leave Job somehow in this hopelessness, sort of, because they don't tell him how they escaped and how he, Job, can escape from that situation himself, whether the tragedy that happened to his sons is going to come upon him. So at the end, it seems that God vindicates the just. So, but what of those who don't get to the end, especially in the chaos and tragedies of life? How do you give hope to those who, like Job, see so much tragedy around them and they don't know how to come out of it to tell the story? And then to you, David, is very fascinating analysis. I think that for me as an African, you see that there's a dual, if you like, total horizon that, or claims that is made on, are made on most of us, the claim of God and the claim of the state, and both are absolute in some sense. However, you tend, I hope I'm interpreting you right, to say the claim or loyalty to the state is based on transactional relationship. So what I can grab from the state. But I think also that is the kind of claim that religion is making on many African Christians today. So it's transactional, and it's also the loyalties are permeable like that of the state. They gravitate from one to the other, most often driven by the needs, quotidian issues. So in this two crisis that I think we find ourselves, the crisis of the nation state and the crisis of religion, how do we escape, like the friends of Job, to tell the story and to give hope that there is some eruption of something new? Thank you.
So the question of Job's vindication is interesting, because in what sense is he vindicated? I guess I wouldn't frame it in terms of that, in quite the words that you put it, that somehow justice is restored to Job. At the end of the story, we end up with God kind of ruling or assessing the various theologies that have been in play. And all along, the friends have been saying God is just, and therefore, if you're having a bad life experience, then because God is just, you must have done something wrong. While all along, Job is saying, this isn't fair. right? This isn't fair. I didn't deserve this. I didn't do anything wrong to deserve these horrors. And so I think what's interesting then is at the end, like God assesses like what has been said about me as God. And he says actually like Job has spoken correctly of me. And Job has been saying for chapters and chapters, like, this was not fair, right? Like God really threw me under the bus. And it's precisely Job's accusations against God that have incurred the wrath of his friends who say, don't you dare, implicate God for your misfortunes. So I think what's so fascinating is that God ultimately is not affirming the theology of the friends that would say all the error is on the human perception side. And why do I think this, so what hope does that give? Well, I guess as a Christian theologian, I'm interested in the way that suffering is kind of turned on its head in the crucifixion. And so something that I think is worth noting is that when Jesus is crucified, it's not simply a matter of him getting killed. And this is where, although I really sympathize with a lot of liberation theology, sometimes I'm left kind of a little underwhelmed where it seems just to be like Jesus was a rebel, the powers put him to death. Because it almost seems too logical in the sense of well, that's what any, kind of effective ruler would do, is you put down a rebel, right? Well, it's not just that Jesus is killed, but he's mocked, right? And so I think it's that element of that kind of paradoxical element of mockery that's at work in Jesus' own death, and which is also present here in the Job story of he's being gaslit the whole time about precisely this issue of well, if God is just, then you must be the problem. And so I think there's something then in an accurate telling of God which can handle the unfairness of the world. Job's story is just unfair. And I think at the end of the day, the Job narrative is okay saying that. God comes in at the end and was like, yeah, Job said it. Job was right. So I want to incorporate that kind of that element of the mockery and the nonsensicality of the suffering as okay to say in theology.
Stan, that's that's a difficult question, but I want to begin. When I was in grad school, my Dr. Father Barry Harvey, when I was struggling with how to come up with a dissertation topic, he said, David, scratch where it itches. Scratch where it itches. I took that to mean that where you feel the pain, that is where you should begin. And where I feel the pain at the moment is the nation state in Africa. Cameroon is where my pain is. It may be that religion, is another crisis. I don't read it that way. The way I read it, perhaps it would be some kind of Marxist thinking of religion as the side of the oppressed. So what is happening in terms of religious development is a kind of symptom of what the nation state is doing to people. And so for me, the crisis is the very nature of the nation state, which has led me to wonder about the assumption that the nation state may be about some kind of good. So what I'm trying to say here is that I think we should discard that view, because it seems to me that based on what is happening, the nation state is not after any kind of good. So for the moment, I do not appear to agree with the idea that religion is a problem in Africa, which many people assume. I don't think so. I think whatever it is that religion is doing to people, it is because of what the nation state has done to people. So I think we should begin there before we can move forward.
I want to add the question of the job. The theology of retribution in Job's book is the most important discussion in economics today. This ideology of meritocracy. Poor people are suffering and deserve their suffering because they are inconscient, inefficient. I don't know why, doesn't matter. And because of that, state cannot help. That is all discussion of the neoliberal project and social democracy that lost. So theology is important, not to discuss church, to understand what's happening in the process of this culture of meritocracy.
Thank you. We have 11 minutes left. We're going to have one question from online, and then we have 2 more in the room. Hopefully we can get those all in the 11 minutes, so keep your answers to the point if we can. Thank you. Go ahead.
So Danae asks, how are we to understand security and stability as an idol versus a necessity as it pertains to Christian communities and societies as a whole, especially if we take the understanding that idols are generated by social systems?
Can you read that one more time? Sorry. Yes. Just in short form.
So how are we to understand security and stability as an idol versus a necessity relating to Christian communities?
I think what I was trying to point out is there has to be an honest account of vulnerability. And I think that's what I was calling for. There are real vulnerabilities, but they are not all the same, right? It is different to be, a refugee in the midst of getting bombed. That's a different kind of vulnerability than, as I was kind of facetiously giving the example of some of my students who, think that they're vulnerable because they're getting an A- rather than an A, right? So I think I'm worried about the relativism of imagining that for every and all reason we can invoke safety or security as a justification for buffering ourselves ever more against the possibility of harm. So I'm not denying that there are real cases where security is needed. I think I forget who it was that was kind of making this distinction between one kind of wealth and natural wealth, like artificial wealth and natural wealth. And maybe that's where that distinction lies. Like the desire for food, the security of food, housing. I'm not saying that people shouldn't want these things, but when it comes to the accumulation of the artificial wealth, then we're talking about security as an idol.
Let me just say one more thing about the question that Stan asked. The view I have that religion is not the issue, it's not a crisis. My reference is Father Jung. He says in African Cry that we shouldn't think that is the case, and I think I agree with what he's saying. Thank you.
Thank you, all three, for most stimulating presentation. But I have a question for Jung. You made clear that your target was the ideology of money and market, not money and market itself. But for the first part of your paper, I thought your target was the capitalist system. How would you label this system you want to replace capitalism with? And could you describe it a little, in just a few sentences, and give us some hints of how we might work towards that?
I think we need to distinguish many kinds of the capitalism. Social democratic, Japanese capitalism, Sweden capitalism, neoliberal capitalism. So my problem first is neoliberal capitalism, okay? I don't want to discuss, there is nothing about what is safe that could be saved in capitalism. It's not metaphysical. There is no solution, metaphysical solution. Bible is sapiential. We discuss within the situation what we can do the best for the life of the victims or the wicked people. That is, this discussion, there is God after that, or there is resurrection. This is problem for God, not for us. Yeah. What is the next system? I don't know. What should be, or what is the utopia, the horizon, is beyond the capitalism. Okay, but this takes a lot of time. So we have to save first life here, not to spend time discussing the lives of the third generation. Of course, climate problem, that is. But in terms of economy. So say, my enemy is neoliberal capitalism. And one thing interesting, that love enemy. Jesus didn't say you are not enemy. There is enemy because within a system that has conflict between. Even you have enemies, you have to love, okay? But you have to accept, analyze, oh, this is our enemy or not adversary.
So maybe we can close out this session by, I'd just like to ask you to kind of relate the three of your presentations together. Stephanie, you presented security as a kind of idolatry, kind of something that sort of stands behind idolatry, a kind of key to a lot of idolatries anyway. And I think with regard to David's presentation, I get how that works. It's a kind of limitation. You talked about this nation state of a limitation, a kind of drawing back, looking for boundaries to protect us from fear and so on, that kind of security. But Jung's presentation seemed to go in the opposite direction, and you talked about going beyond limits, right? That the primordial problem behind capitalism is this attempt to kind of grasp a sort of unlimited, it's not an object, that any particular object, but it's going kind of beyond limits to this kind of unlimited horizon where you can get whatever you want. So I wonder if you all would just reflect on what the relationship between those, between limits and unlimited are with regard to idolatry.
Well, I think for me, limit in terms of the nation state is not so much that it protects us or it draws us in, but rather that it actively harms us. I think that is how it limits us. And theologically, I think it is anti-theological. The nation state is anti-theological in the sense that it gives us an identity. It gives us an identity that seems to be contrary to a kind of Christian identity we should have. Paul says Paul says, I think in 2 Corinthians, which I showed earlier, that if you are in Christ, you are a new creation. But the nation state says to us, if you are in Cameroon, you are a Cameroonian. You are a new creation. And right now in Cameroon there is a war going on. People are trying to create a new country called Ambazonia. So if that succeeds, it's going to be that if you are in Ambazonia, you are an Ambazonian, and so you become the enemy, which is really what is going on right now. You become the enemy of the Cameroonian, right? So it limits us in that sense, in that it captures us and it actively harms us and claims identity upon us that I think is anti-theological.
On the relationship between idol as security or idol as kind of capitalistic market, I think they're related, But I think why I was suggesting that security might be somehow like even deeper than money, mammon, is just because in some of the narratives that were so compelling, like in Eugene's presentation, like it's such a blatant obsession with money. And I just don't know that I always see that as the most insidious form of money. Like maybe it's just the circles that I'm running in, but like I don't know a lot of people who are actually just trying to get like as many red Ferraris as they can. I think I see wealth accumulation happening in more subtle ways where it's often like quite hidden in terms of money being just stockpiled in investment accounts, and universities that are rich just like racking up endless endowments as they watch, poor institutions crater. That's the kind of thing I think I'm worried about in the moment, where it's not necessarily, the late 19th century preacher saying, God is wanting you to stock up piles of gold. Like, it's just not that blatant always. And I guess the other thing I was trying to address, what I'm really concerned about is idolatries within the church. I guess that's kind of where I was coming from. And I was thinking about the previous question from online. I guess what I'm worried about, and why I'm hitting on security rather than money itself, is because I think there's a dangerous perception in some wings of the church that we're supposed to be trying to avoid suffering, right? Like, there's so many efforts in the American church to say, like, oh, we need our legal situation such that we never have to suffer for being Christian, or, can we stack the Supreme Court in such a way that, like, I would never lose a job or income because of my Catholic faith. And that gets kind of extended to the Chinese case and all these discussions about religious freedom and like, oh, isn't it horrible that Christians would have to suffer anywhere? And I do think it's bad. Like, in no way am I like saying that we should seek out suffering or like suffering. I think it should be seen for the ill that it is. And yet, to think of the church as fundamentally like trying to protect itself from having to suffer for the faith seems just kind of historically wrong to me. Like, when you think of the early Christians under Rome who were persecuted, like, they knew what they were getting into and held to the kind of acceptance that they were taking up a cross. So I think that's what I'm worried about, is like Christians who are obsessed with their own safety is like giving up so much of what Christian faithfulness entails in terms of being willing to take the hit if that's what comes. So that's kind of my concern about the church being too obsessed with its own safety.
I think when the human species started to discover that there is he will die, that there is death. This is the question. We don't want desire. So he create the notion of immortal soul to say that I am not dead. I'm not going to die. But since that is not, you cannot see, I want something. I desire the infinity, not to die. What is the idol that can you promise that? This is a temptation to Jesus on the desert. Nowadays, it's not religion, not magic, this science, technology. This book, Life 3.0, I don't remember, yeah, this transhumanism. Why this Elon Musk? What is this? Why does he need so much money to overcome death? Because to get technology to produce that, immortally, is very, very expensive. In order to get there, you have to justify the inequality. So that is why I said sacrifice is the inversion of what's good and bad. I'm doing this, not because I'm bad, but because I'm giving. The guy said, the most important guy that's a discussion, it's moral imperative to overcome the death. Because of that, we need to do everything that we can. Over that, to that, you have to accumulate a lot of money to create a special technology. This is a temptation by Jesus and the
Thank
desert.
you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your participation in this session. And thank you, everyone, for your participation online, here in the room, presenting, questioning, everything over the whole conference. And we will, on your way out, if you've been like me putting off all the time getting a book, I think you have one last chance to get a book, but we'll close with some words from Bill. Thanks.
Thanks, Abdul-Malik. At the end of this conference, I find myself filled with gratitude for all the tremendous conversations and presentations that we've had. I'm also filled with deep regret that I have already published this book, because there's so much I want to add to it now and go back and revise and everything. But it's done, and so I'll just look forward to more conversations. And the book that will come out of this conference, which will be part of our book series, the books from our book series are out there as well if you want to take a look at those. So I want to thank everybody that came and listened here in person and online. I want to thank our wonderful presenters for a terrific series of reflections. And last but not least at all, I want to thank the people that made this conference happen. And by that, I mean the staff of the Center for World Catholicism, Marlon Aguilar, Karen Kraft, and Elliot Ellis, who are the wizards behind the scenes. So thank you so much for that. So thanks again, and please stay in touch.